I'm Ann Neese. For my master's work in the Plant Biology and Conservation program, I'm studying native Illinois orchids. But with the Illinois Orchid Society, I grow my own tropical orchids at home. So I'm going to show you today how to repot orchids. Something important to do after you buy one, and also something important to do every year or so. You may choose to display your orchids in decorative pots, or you might even buy one in a decorative pot. The first trick is to know that your orchid is actually in a plastic pot inside the decorative pot. So you can just lift it out and take the orchid out of the plastic pot. So you want to look for your plant tag and make sure you don't lose it. And then I'm going to gently turn my orchid over and just kind of squish the pot. And some orchids have sticky roots, so it can be difficult to get them out. You might want to wear gloves. Because orchids are potted in bark, you may have splinters in there, and sphagnum moss tends to have prickly thorns inside of it. Also, a lot of growers use pesticides and fungicides on their orchids, and you don't want to get those chemicals on your bare hands. You'll notice there are some new roots starting right here. So when it turns brown to white and then that yellow little tip, these are the new roots starting. So sometimes, like happened with this orchid, the roots are really packed together and they've become what's called pot bound. So you notice that the roots take on the shape of the pot. This will discourage the plant from taking up space in the new pot and sending the roots out the way they need to go. They'll just kind of keep growing in this pattern. So we want to knock them loose. But in order to not break them, they're a bit dried out and stiff right now, so I'm going to soak them in some water. This water is actually got a solution of a viricide to make sure that any pathogens that might be on the plant roots are going to get killed, and if there's any root rot present, that it will kill that also. So I'm just going to set the orchid down into it, and I'm going to let it soak for a few minutes. So as you can see from this plant, just a little bit of soaking even can make pulling apart the roots much more easy, because when the roots are saturated, they're less sticky. So what I'm doing now is I'm just pulling the roots apart gently. They do snap, so you don't want to be too rough with them, but you don't have to be too gentle. If they're really saturated, a lot of times they're so flexible that you can be pretty rough. In general, thinner roots are easier to be rough with, and thicker roots tend to be a bit more brittle and more difficult to not break. So what I'm doing is I'm just looking for any dead roots that might be inside the root mass here, and I want to pull those ones out. I also want to loosen the root mass up so that when it goes into the new pot, it's really going to send down roots into the whole pot and spread out a bit more, and it's not going to be so tightly bound up. This Paphiopedilum was packed in bark mix, and here you can see the bark mix, and you see it's a fairly fine mix, and it's actually not in that bad of condition. Probably what happened is, in this case, this plant was just watered too much, and they waited, although they used a high quality bark mix, they waited too long to put it into a bigger pot. In general, plants want to go about once a year, repot them. If you get a really high quality bark mix, something that's been kiln dried, you might get 2 or 3 years, but then you should probably go with a slightly larger pot because they're going to need more room to expand if you wait longer to repot. In general, you don't want to go with a pot that's much bigger than the one the orchid was packed in, or you could even put it back into its original pot. Most orchids prefer to be root bound, and it's easier to not overwater them if they're in a smaller pot. So what I'm going to do now, I seem to have gotten most of the material loosened up that I'm going to get for now. It's still pretty tight, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse it, and hopefully that will loosen some stuff up and get some of the dirt from in between the roots. So I'm just going to take it in this bowl of water here, and this is also water with the solution in it, and I'm just going to gently go up and down like this, and it's knocking loose all of the decomposed potting material and any loose chunks of bark. And you can see a little bit of suds forming, and that's just from the solution. So now I'm going to check the roots again after I've washed it some and see if there's any more dead root material that's shown up. So I'm going to do one final check for any rotted roots. And you can tell the rotted ones from the healthy ones a lot of times just by feeling them. So rotted ones will be squishy, especially after it's been soaking. They will have absorbed some water and they've gotten mushy, and the healthy roots will be nice and firm. So the other thing I want to do is repotting is a really good opportunity to trim up your plant and make it look nicer, because it's not in the pot, so it's a lot more flexible to work with. So I want to cut off these dead leaf ends just because they're aesthetically unattractive, and also the leaf will continue to degrade in a lot of cases if there's dead material, but if you cut it, it will stay green. So this is a good example where this one was cut, and you can see the rest of the leaf is still green, so it's still useful for the plant. So I'm going to use a straight razor for this. Be careful with them though, because they're extremely sharp. I try to not use them more than I have to because I tend to cut myself. So I'm just going to lay the leaf on a flat surface and then cut across it. Some people like to cut at an angle so that it looks like the leaf does naturally. I like to leave as much of the photosynthetic material as I can behind, and since the plant's not ready to go into a show or anything, I don't know how much aesthetics matter at this point, but it's really up to you, whatever you prefer. That little bit of lost material is not really going to make a huge difference to the plant. So I'm going to put this one in a bigger, this is the pot it originally came in, and I'm actually going to put it in a much larger pot. That's because the roots are extremely bound right now. Also, Paphiopedilums tend to be more water loving than a lot of other orchids, so some extra potting material is not going to damage it too much. I like to put these a little bit lower in their pots because the leaves are so flexible and then they can kind of catch over the edge. But you can also put it higher in the pot if you want to. So what I want to try to do is get the base of the plants lined up with the bottom rim here, or with this rim on the edge. So I'm going to kind of hold it like that. And now for this one, I'm going to use this smaller bark mix over here, the finer bark mix, because the roots are smaller than they were on the Phalaenopsis, and also because the smaller bark mix has more surface area for water to adhere to, so the mix will stay wetter. This one is a little bit different than the other one. It's got charcoal in it. And again, you want to try to get the plant in the middle of the pot. That way it can go out on all sides. It's going to look nice for you. And don't hesitate, if you need a second hand, to ask someone to help you out. I know with some of my bigger orchids, I always have to get a friend or my husband to come over and hold it for me. Again, I'm just going to come down and I'm going to work the potting mix down in between the roots. Most orchids bloom once a year. Some of them bloom more than that, but a lot of them bloom just once a year. And so you might not have a flower the next year that you expect it, but the year after. That's okay, don't be too worried about that. It's just the plant adjusting. Some take a little bit longer than others to adjust. But you still want to do it because if you don't repot, you're not going to have a healthy plant. So in the case of something that if you repotted it and then a year later it doesn't bloom, don't repot it again, just wait and then you'll get a bloom the following year. All right, so then you want to put your tag, if you have one, back into your pot so you don't forget what plant you've got. And then you can put your orchid pot back into your decorative pot. You never want to pot directly into your decorative pots because they don't have holes in them. And what you want to do is when you're watering, you want to take the orchid out of the decorative pot, water it, and then put it back in after it's finished draining so that your roots don't get too wet. You're welcome to come to the spring show at the Chicago Botanic Garden. The Illinois Orchid Society will be there selling and repotting plants, and the garden will have a beautiful display of many different orchids from across the world.